Most historians and musicologists trace the origins of the Filipino Kundiman to the second half of the 19th century. Considering the political turmoil of that period, from the Cavite Mutiny of 1872 to the Philippine Revolution of 1896, it would seem reasonable to assume that a poetic and musical art form such as the Kundiman, which is characterized by melancholy, anguish, pessimism, and reluctant optimism, would be born in this tragic era of violence, despair, and revolutionary romance. Yet there is one poem, Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay, To the Love of My Life, which may possibly challenge this narrative. While its year of composition is thus far uncertain, it may predate the period historians often associate with the birth of the Filipino Kundiman, and may even be one of the oldest lyrical poem of its kind, considering that its presumed author, Don Francisco Baltazar, a preeminent Tagalog poet, was born in 1788 and lived most of his formative years as a writer in the first half of the 19th century. If so, Francisco Baltazar, a poet regarded by his admirers as the Dante, Cervantes, or Shakespeare of the Tagalog language, may also be the father of the Filipino Kundiman. This possibility will be considered, but beyond this lecture will also explore related areas of interest, which will be broken down into the following 4 sections. The first section, entitled Kundiman versus Love Poem, will demonstrate that Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay is not just a generic love song, but actually possesses all 3 of the elements that qualifies it to be considered a true example of a traditional Kundiman. The second section, called How Did Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay Sound Like?, analyzes the extent of Spanish musical influence in the Philippines and its possible role in the composition and interpretation of the Kundiman in question. The third section, entitled Controversy of Authenticity, briefly discusses why some historians have questioned the reliability of the original publisher of this poem. And finally, the last section, called The Historical Significance of Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay, will consider the implications this forgotten work will have in understanding the origins and evolution of the Filipino Kundiman. Baltazar's biographer, Hermenegildo Cruz y de Castro, referred to the poem in question as a Kundiman in 1906, without fully explaining his reason for doing so. To understand why this was an appropriate categorization, I will compare Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay with other lyrical poems considered to be authentic examples of a traditional Filipino Kundiman. The first poem to be used for comparison is patriotic in nature and is aptly titled Kundiman. Its author is also uncertain, but it has been attributed in the past to the Filipino national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, and alternatively to the second Prime Minister of the First Philippine Republic, Pedro Paterno. For the purposes of this lecture, this will simply be referred to as the Spanish Kundiman, as it was written in this language and also because its author is uncertain. The second Kundiman that will be examined is the more common romantic type, called Marupok na Sumpa, or in English, A Weak Vow. It was composed by Felipe Maninang and sung quite exceptionally by one of the greatest Kundimaneros, Larry Miranda. Now, whether romantic or patriotic, as you will notice, some of the best examples of the traditional Kundiman, including those chosen for this lecture, often have one or all 3 of the following elements in common: pagdurusa, suffering; duda, doubt; and pag-asa, hope. Both the Spanish Kundiman and Marupok na Sumpa contain all 3 of the aforementioned elements. But to avoid making this lecture longer than it has to be, and in order to provide the best example possible, only one Kundiman will be used for comparison against Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay for each of the 3 elements. In the Spanish Kundiman, pagdurusa is expressed indirectly as a lament for the political condition of the Philippines. This was achieved without the use of the word suffering, or its Spanish equivalent, el sufrimiento. Its author writes in the first stanza, Una tierra hermosa henchida de encantos, con fuertes cadenas el spot abruma. Ay, esa es mi patria de amor. A lovely land bursting with enchantment, with strong chains as being oppressed by a tyrant. Ah, this is my native country, my beloved motherland. In Sa Kinakasinya Ring Buhay, pagdurusa is also expressed indirectly without using the specific word. But the suffering referred to here is romantic in nature, as it deals with a tragedy in the Kundimanero's personal love life. In this case, Baltazar's poem, which was said to be composed in behalf of a young harp teacher, laments the fact that he, that is, the teacher, could not express his love for his female music student, who had very strict parents. And so he ended his song with, Walang magagawa, kundi ang dumaing. Nothing else can be done, other than to grieve. Now, though the subject of the two poems differed, in both cases, the authors were clearly in pain, and expressed their grief. One for his country, and the other for himself. In addition to this suffering is the second element of the Cundiman, duda or doubt. The patriotic Spanish Cundiman expresses this sentiment by saying, Ay de mí si muero, sin ver su esplendor. Poor me if I die, without seeing your splendor. He believes that the Philippines can be free, and in a better state than at the time when this Spanish Cundiman was written. But its author expressed doubts that he would live to see this dream come true. Similarly, Sa Kinakasinya Ring Buhay expresses doubts about the future. However, unlike the patriot and the Spanish Cundiman, the harp teacher in Baltazar's work has more control to influence his destiny. Thus, he considers various strategies relying on actions rather than words to declare his love without explicitly saying so. His only uncertainty is in whether his efforts will accomplish his ultimate goal of revealing his true feelings for his student. While he ultimately adopts a subtle approach, he doubts whether it is the best way to go. And, as though questioning his own plan, he states, Di rin magbabawas na mangyaring nais, na ipaunawang kita'y iniibig. Besides, it will not reduce my desire to tell you that I love you. Again, we see a commonality between the Spanish Cundiman and Sa Kinakasinya Ring Buhay. While the authors of both poems have not yet conceded defeat, they lack confidence and obviously feel that their dream is still nothing more than a dream, and likely to remain so for an indefinite length of time. In short, we observe in both works the second element of the Cundiman, doubt. With all this suffering and doubt, it may seem strange to say, but the third element of the Cundiman is actually pag-asa or hope. Of course, what sets apart a Cundiman from a generic Filipino sad song or poem is this particular element. Rather than spending the entire song or poem complaining and discussing grief, the Cundiman also paints a faint rainbow among the clouds. That is, there is hope to accompany the darkness. Yet this hope is not always so straightforward. The Cundiman's version of pag-asa can be described as pessimistic or reluctant because of the fatalistic way hope is often expressed. In Marupok na Sumpa, for example, hope is expressed in the following manner.
Buti pang mamatay at sa langit ako liligaya.
The Cundimanero in this case has not completely given up on the idea of being happy once again, but his hope is expressed rather pessimistically, because while he still believes in finding joy, it is in the afterlife. Here on earth, he insinuated that the chances of reconciliation, while not impossible, is highly unlikely. This is clearly not the type of optimism that would immediately come to mind when one thinks of the word hope. But this pessimistic and somewhat ironic hope is a trademark of the Filipino Kundiman. With regards to sa kinakasinya-ring buhay, the Kundiman's version of hope is also present. While the harp teacher / Kundimanero cannot express his love for his student directly with words, he still has at least some hope that she will realize what she means to him through his music. He says, "Kaya nga't, kung minsang iyong nahihingi, tumugtog ng alpa ang palad kong sawi. Dalangin mataos sa Diyos na hari, maging dila, yaring lahat kong daliri." Thus, if one time you ask that I play on my harp my unfortunate fate, my sincerest prayer to God the King was that my fingers be my tongue. Yet this hope is tempered by his pessimism, for while he acknowledges that his student may eventually understand what his harp is trying to say, that day is uncertain, and until then, as was mentioned earlier, walang magagawa kunding dumaing. Nothing else can be done other than to grieve. Thus, as was the case with Marupok na Sumpa, Baltazar's purported work is also pessimistically optimistic. With this said, it is clear that all three elements of the Kundiman are as present in sa kinakasinya-ring buhay as they were in the other works used for comparison. Therefore, it is safe to conclude that Hermenegildo Cruz did not err in his categorization. Sa kinakasinya-ring buhay is, indeed, a Kundiman. Knowing what we do about the lyrical aspect of this song, our attention is now turned to its musical component. Unfortunately, the publication of this Kundiman in 1906 was not accompanied by musical notation. How it may have sounded, in particular its melody, therefore, is left to speculation. It is possible, though, to at least get an idea of the instrumental portion of this song. A clue was given within the fourth stanza. It was intended to be accompanied by an alpa, which was the Filipinization of the Spanish word arpa, or harp in English. It may seem strange to Filipinos today that the instrument chosen for this Kundiman would be the harp. Some may even argue that sa kinakasinya-ring buhay cannot qualify as a Kundiman because the instruments commonly associated with this genre of traditional Filipino music, as can be heard in the recordings in the first half of the 20th century, include the Spanish guitar, as well as the bandurria, the violin, the laúd, the piano, the bajo de uñas, the octavina filipina de 14 cuerdas, but not the harp, with the exception of Sa Laot ng Karagatan, which briefly features the harp in the opening sequence. While it may seem unusual to Filipinos now, in the centuries in which Baltazar lived, the harp was just as popular as the Spanish guitar. In fact, about 6 years after Baltazar was born, a Spaniard observed that the harp was un instrumento músico del rey David, muy usado entre estos y locos, desde que la vieron tocar a un soldado español, de aquellos conquistadores. However, the harp was not just popular in the Ilocos Norte and Ilocos Sur provinces. In Manila, where Baltazar lived for a portion of his life, this instrument was equally as loved. The Spaniard Murillo Velarde, who is now more famous for his 1734 map of the Philippines, had this to say in 1752. Raro es el indio que cerca de Manila no sabe arpa, y hay muchos, y excelentes violonistas, aoístas y flautistas de varios géneros. Por la facilidad que tienen los indios en aprender lo que ven, se dice que los indios tienen el entendimiento en los ojos. These Spanish accounts show that it would not have been unusual or impossible for a Kundiman to be written for a harp. If anything, they provide support to the possibility that this Kundiman could have been written by Baltazar in the first half of the 19th century, given the popularity and widespread use of this instrument during this period of time in the province where he resided. Yet while these accounts support the idea of a Kundiman being composed for a harp, they do not give us a clue as to how it specifically sounded. We know from the surviving recordings of the first half of the 20th century, the musical aspect of the Kundiman had European and Latin American influences. In these recordings, we hear the vocalization of the Spanish zarzuela, or, as we would say in Tagalog, zarzuela. The tremolo of the Spanish rondalla, or, as we would say in Tagalog, rondalia. The rhythm of the Latin American habanera, albeit a slower version.
Madilim ang gabi nung tayo'y namamasyal, ni isang bituin sa atin ay walang tanglaw.
And the string orchestra common to all Western European classical music. But do these recordings of the 20th century Cundimaneros and Cundimaneras, such as Ruben Tagalog, Larry Miranda, Conchita Rosal, and Celi Bautista, reflect the Cundiman of Baltazar's era? The answer is both yes and no. Baltazar's Cundiman differs significantly in that it was intended, as suggested by its lyrics, to be accompanied only by a harp. There is nothing else written within the words or in the notation of the 1906 publication to suggest that it was meant to be accompanied by any other instrument. In comparison, the recordings of the Cundimaneros of the first half of the 20th century often had an entire orchestra accompanying them. Nonetheless, if there is one thing that Baltazar's generation had in common with that of Ruben Tagalog, Conchita Rosal, and other Cundimaneros and Cundimaneras of the early 20th century, it is the influence of Spanish music in Filipino music. This influence would have been even more pronounced in Baltazar's time, considering that American cultural influence in the Philippines at that point had not yet attained the strength that it would later have in the 20th century, after the US overthrew the República Filipina and enforced President McKinley's policy of assimilation. When we examine written eyewitness accounts, long before the US occupation, we get a glimpse of the depths Spanish influence had permeated Filipino musical culture. In 1676, for example, which was about a century before Baltazar was born, the Spaniard Francisco de Santa Ines observed, "Ya todos danzan, bailan tañen y cantan a nuestro modo, y usan de todos los instrumentos de los españoles, y cantan de manera que nosotros no les hacemos ventaja. Ellos son los músicos en todas las iglesias de estas islas, así de la Catedral de Manila, como de las demás iglesias y conventos que están dentro y fuera de la ciudad. Y apenas se hallará un pueblo que no tenga su música con bastantes voces y tiples y muchos instrumentos. Y es común sentir, de los que han visto, uno y otro, que hay aquí músicas que pueden competir con algunas de las catedrales de España." Aside from Santa Ines and other Spanish observers, there were also foreigners who made similar observations. In voyages made in the year 1788 and 1789, an Englishman, Mr. John Meares, who visited the Philippines in 1788, had this to say about the native Filipino musicians he encountered. They, that is the Filipinos, knew many of our English country dances and several of our popular and favorite tunes. But, in performing the fandango, they had attained a degree of excellence that the nicest ears of Spain would have heard with pleasure. Based on these accounts, it is clear that however Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay may have sounded like, it would likely have had Spanish influence to it. Until the musical score to this Cundiman is discovered, or unless a historical document can be found linking the Cundiman of Baltazar's generation to any one of the many genres of Spanish and Latin American music, it cannot be said with certainty that the Cundiman in question had the same exact Hispanic influences as that of the early 20th century. Whereas we can hear and see elements of the zarzuela, the rondalla, and most significant of all, the habanera, in the recordings of Ruben Tagalog, Conchita Rosal, Larry Miranda, and Danilo Santos, we can only make a general assumption that Baltazar's Cundiman was accompanied by a harp and would have had some degree of Spanish influence. Which genre in particular is difficult to say. Hispanic music is so diverse that speculating would result in a flamenco, habanera, fandango, and bolero version of Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay, and many other versions. At best, we know from John Meary's account that the Filipino musicians around the time Baltazar was born were well acquainted and influenced by the Spanish fandango. However, it is unlikely that Baltazar's sorrowful song would be composed for a lively and upbeat genre such as this. While the fandango cannot be completely ruled out, we have to consider the possibility that the tempo would have been significantly slowed down for the harp, just as the Cundimaneros did with the habanera for the guitar in the late 19th and early 20th century. Hopefully in the future, a harpist familiar with Spanish harp music composed in the years 1788 to 1862 will arrange Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay in accordance with the prevailing musical style of that period, and this may give musicologists a glimpse of the sound of this historic work. Beyond the further research required to replicate the sound of this Cundiman, more investigation is needed to determine its authenticity as well. Unfortunately for the author of Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay, the individual responsible for publishing this work is someone whose scholarship is now under question by a number of historians. While musicologists and historians should be indebted to Hermenegildo Cruz y de Castro, for it was he who is said to have obtained this poem from Baltazar's descendants, and who was also responsible for publishing it in 1906, they will likely question whether this poem is really the work of Francisco Baltazar, because it was published by Hermenegildo in the same book, along with Sa Aking Mga Kabata, To My Fellow Children, which is a poem he attributed to Dr. Jose Rizal, but was shown by later historical analysis to have been written by someone else. Although in fairness, it should be noted that not everything published by Hermenegildo Cruz is of suspicious scholarship and equally scrutinized by historians. In light of this Rizal Sa Aking Mga Kabata controversy, however, further documentation is needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Francisco Baltazar was indeed the author of Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay, as was claimed in the 1906 publication. Even with the authorship in question, and without knowing the poem's exact melody, it is still very much a significant work in the world of traditional Filipino music and history. Would it really matter whether or not Francisco Baltazar himself wrote this masterpiece? After all, his legacy was already cemented in his epic Tagalog poem, Florante at Laura, which went on to influence national figures such as Dr. Jose Rizal, Supremo Andres Bonifacio, and Primer Ministro Apolinario Mabini, who all learned to appreciate their native Tagalog language from this single poem. Moreover, Baltazar already had the distinction of elevating Tagalog from the colloquial to the language of serious scholarship, garnering even the praises of the Spanish colonial authorities, such as the Spaniard Padre Toribio Minguea, who wrote in 1878, Tal vez en poesía, solo merece leerse el corrido de don Francisco Baltazar titulado Florante y Laura. Hay ahí rotondidez y limpieza de frase, sin estar recargado en el fondo de conceptos soporíferos. Thus, proving that Baltazar was the author of Sa Kinakasinyaring Buhay will not change his standing as the most important Tagalog poet of all time. Furthermore, Any additional titles he may gain from future proof of his authorship of the poem in question, for example, father of the Filipino Kundiman, would be superfluous. Of course, that does not mean that tying his name to this work is no longer necessary. Proving that he wrote this Kundiman should still be carried out, but not for any more titles, but because as a simple matter of principle, it is only proper to give credit where credit is due. More importantly though, if Baltazar's authorship could be proven, it would help in determining when this work was composed. And this, in the grander scheme of things, is where the real historical significance of this Cundiman lies. When we consider that Baltazar lived most of his life as a writer in the first half of the 19th century, we are forced to question much of the accepted theories and traditions surrounding the origins of the Cundiman. Contrary to what historians have thus far assumed, the Cundiman may have already developed before the year 1850. Knowing that Baltazar was born in 1788 and learned poetry from an 18th century poet, we can go further and even consider the possibility that the Cundiman may have already existed prior to the year 1800, and that he may have learned this Filipino art form from his mentor or other older Tagalog poets. If so, the so-called Cundiman de 1800, also known as Joseli ng Baliwag, which some historians regard as being the first or oldest known Cundiman, despite the inconsistent fact that it was composed for a woman, Josefa Thiongson, who was not even around in the year 1800, may not actually be the oldest of its kind. Other older Cundimans, yet to be discovered, may exist. Sa Kinakasinya Ring Buhay opens the door to this and so many other possibilities that up to now simply seemed unimaginable. While it may seem useless or even vain to place so much importance in establishing the age of this long-forgotten poem, by tying it to Francisco Baltazar, it will definitely help musicologists in the future when studying how the Cundiman evolved in structure, content, and sound over its more than 150 years or so of existence as the traditional form of music and poetry of the Philippines. Although it may be a stretch at this point to regard Sa Kinakasinya Ring Buhay as the prototype for all Cundimans subsequently composed, this poem will help correct the timeline of the Cundiman's existence and provide more clarity for its obscure origins. Its greatest legacy, however, if proven to be an authentic example of Francisco Baltazar's work, will be tied not only to the past, but also to the future. Knowing that the Cundiman evolved from Baltazar's time to that of Ruben Tagalog, from the subjects to the instruments used, opens the possibility for further evolution. Such an evolution is needed now more than ever, given the serious decline of interest of this traditional musical and poetic art form among younger generations of Filipinos. For example, rather than adhering to what has been regarded for the past 100 years as traditional themes for authenticity's sake, new subjects more relevant to the Filipino youths of today, such as poverty, corruption, violence, life overseas, and other socio-economic problems, could be incorporated into future compositions, which would make the Cundiman more than just a love song and relevant for Filipinos of the 21st century. Although such an expansion would be frowned upon by traditionalists, the evolution seen since Baltazar's era to that of Ruben Tagalog not only set the precedent for change, but also justifies it. Hopefully in time, all Filipinos will value Sa Kinakasinya Ring Buhay to the same extent as Florante at Laura, and realize that it may not only provide a key to unlocking the origins of the Cundiman's past, but may also play a role in preserving its future.